once again, thank you to Eric Trump, the president's son coming here and really laying out the vision for Bitcoin. And, in a lot of ways, it feels like the past 4 years, speaking, from an American standpoint, it's been a lot about what can we hold on to as an industry. As there's been just difficult regulatory apparatus, all sorts of things kind of holding back Bitcoin. Now that we're entering into a new cycle, into a new regime, around the world, tones are changing. And the question is not what can we hold on to, but it's Bitcoin is here. Now what are we going to build with it? And so, Yat, maybe you can give a quick introduction about Animoca, some of the darlings in Hong Kong, and what you guys are building.
Sure, yeah. My name is Yat. I'm chairman, co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're a company based in Hong Kong. Today, we're kind of known to be, investors mostly in Web3 gaming, culture, entertainment, although we do a lot more than that. We have over 540 portfolio companies in the Web3 space broadly, including in the Bitcoin ecosystem, of course, as well. And, we're about 1,200 people worldwide, basically building products and engaged in the space. And I have to say that, we're based in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been very pro Web3. I'm part of the Web3 task force that is basically advising the government on basically Web3 activity. And it's interesting, right? Because before, Hong Kong actually benefited from the somewhat negative regulatory framework that the US had. In fact, a lot of entrepreneurs would move to places like Dubai and Hong Kong and maybe Singapore. And now everyone's talking about, maybe we should go back to the US and there's something happening there. So you can already see that happening. Which I think is a good thing, not just because the US is the center of a lot of that innovation, but also because it brings more competition in the market as well, which is good as well. So I also think that there's going to be an acceleration of different jurisdictions around the world now wanting to compete for that attention. It's kind of like, we can be a little bit this, a little bit that, because we don't have to worry as much. And I think a lot of other nation states that were sensitive on basically Bitcoin and digital assets are now opening up, in part because they want to make sure that they are also in favor with the current administration.
Absolutely. And so, getting right into it, Bitcoin is the money of the internet. And you can hold money, you can spend money, you can invest it. And there's a lot of new paradigms being built around really terms from the last cycle. It's the terms like NFTs and metaverse. They're a dirty word to a lot of Bitcoiners now. But those concepts are sticking around, and they've survived the bear market too. So talk to us about, from the side of building a digital universe, building a digital ecosystem, building a digital social framework. What are we finding that's interesting? What's starting to be built, and what's Bitcoin's role in that?
So maybe there's a couple things to unpack there. First, I think the definition that some people like, Powell's statement around Bitcoin as digital gold, I think it holds very true in the sense that it is the kind of reserve asset of Web3 and what you might call the open metaverse. And I think when other projects launch, right, whether they be NFTs or tokens in other ecosystems, what's actually also interesting is that when they start making value there, what's the asset that they actually go into? They don't go into US dollars, they go into Bitcoin. So actually what happens is that Bitcoin becomes essentially grows with the entire ecosystem as a whole, right? They all say, okay, fine, I made some money on my NFTs or I made some money in Web3 gaming. What's the asset ultimately I want to have? And that's Bitcoin. And so I think Bitcoin's role very much underpins that, and the rest of the growth of Web3 broadly actually expands space. The framework that we like to think, though, in terms of what we care about as humans is when we look at Bourdieu's forms of capital. I think those are very good ways to define that, right? He defines them, broadly speaking, under economic, symbolic, social, and cultural capital, right? Those are the four types of capital that we care about as people. For instance, what do we spend most of our money on in the physical world? We actually spend it in forms of symbolic and cultural capital. Symbolic as in a degree or the kind of reputation I have. Cultural in terms of clothes that I wear. For instance, some people like to wear Gucci or some wear Versace or Birkin bags. Doesn't matter what it is. The amount of money that we spend on these kind of cultural items is actually more than what we spend on, we might make money on the economic capital, But actually, how do we distinguish ourselves? We distinguish ourselves through the cultural capital, right? Where we live, cars we have, those type of things. Those matter to us, right? Otherwise, we'd all be wearing black and we're driving the same kind of car, and we'd basically be living in like 1984 type of scenario because we'd all be wearing the same stuff, and there would be no cultural expression. We wouldn't have tattoos, we wouldn't have different stuff, right? So that's the point. And so, like the internet today, a lot of people used to say that in the early days of the internet, that the last mile wins, the telco infrastructure, the one that provides the infrastructure would win. At the end, who won in the internet? It was everything that was social, basically all the social networks, cultural, gaming, entertainment, movies, all these type of things, right? And in fact, most jobs are employed in the kind of cultural economies in the world. Any country that has low cultural economies actually tend to be very poor, right? Whereas if you think of any other country in the world that has high cultural sort of spend, in film, culture, arts, whatever, actually those are the strongest GDPs. And I think this is one of the things that maybe sometimes gets missed by people in the early stages of, say, Bitcoin, because they look at things like ordinals and they look at things like that as kind of, that's not really the purpose of it. But actually, we don't distinguish ourselves based on just sort of how much assets we have in value. We distinguish ourselves on our individual things that we own and that are special to us, which comes maybe to the other point where Bitcoin's value comes from. I personally think that Bitcoin is going to be worth millions of dollars per Bitcoin, not because it's going to be used as a currency, because the culture of Bitcoin is to hold, right? But it's because it's going to be the ultimate status item, right? In the digital economy of the future, which we I think all agree with, it's going to be more digital rather than less digital. Owning one Bitcoin is going to be the ultimate status item. It's actually like an NFT, right? If I own this Bitcoin, then that means I get invited to certain things because I can prove I'm an owner of that. Clubs will open, restaurant memberships, all these things will happen because you own that. Whether this is in, maybe there'll be ordinals and that type of stuff too, but the ultimate proof of that ownership, the same way that we exit into Bitcoin, that ownership of that Bitcoin becomes that ultimate status item because that's actually what we care about. We care about our relative status more than we care about how much money we have. It's like how we define millionaires. If you're a millionaire, that's great. But what's the difference between a 1 millionaire, 3 millionaire, 5 millionaire? Actually, reputationally, not that much, right? You could have 10 million, but you're still a millionaire. That's why we have these terms of like billionaires suddenly, right, as the next category. What about all those people in between? I mean, they're worth a ton, but somehow reputationally we don't care about them as much because they've got that division. But then we say, oh, but he owns this special piece of art. Or this guy ate a banana that was taped on the wall, right? And that gave him reputation. Again, why do we spend that kind of money on that? We spend money on that because it gives us a story that's owned by us, and it's the cultural capital that gives us that status.
No, absolutely. And I like your idea, too, about owning one Bitcoin is going to be such a powerful thing very soon. I mean, Bitcoin's at $100,000 already. It's only increasing from here.
There's more than 21 million millionaires in the world, that's for sure.
More than 21 million millionaires, fewer than 21 million Bitcoin, and only 2 million more to mine. And so I think we have roughly maybe 100 million Bitcoiners around the world, let's say, maybe 200 million now. There's 7.6 billion people. Not a lot of Bitcoin to yes.
And speaking of that sort of, let's call it that status game, while obviously it can be split and it can be shared ownership and Satoshis and all that kind of stuff, the point is that I think we'll hit a point in the future where owning the one full Bitcoin will have a status value that emerges more than the fragmented value because it's something as a whole, right? It's kind of how we look at art, for instance, as well. The whole collection is worth more than the individual pieces when you put that together. And again, we're not there yet, but I think that's where it's going to go.
Absolutely. So now, pivoting a little bit, I had kind of asked earlier, what is it that we're seeing being built today that you're super excited about? What is that kind of virtual or digital society, the digital assets that are springing up? What do they look like? And again, how do you think Bitcoin will maybe interact with that world?
So first, the fundamental way that we look at the future is around what we describe as digital property rights, meaning that this is the first time really that you can own a piece of basically a network asset. And I think before we even go around property rights in terms of you could own a gaming asset or you could own a token, actually you're owning a completely new type of asset that never really existed before, which is a network asset. Right? So we talk about an equity instrument. You own shares in a company or you could own a building, right? Or you have things like currency, whatever. But a network asset actually represents the network, ownership of the network effects of that particular network state. And so we see this, for instance, in Bitcoin, right? If I own a Bitcoin, I'm not just owning the Bitcoin. The Bitcoin in and of itself isn't the value. It's the fact that 100 million people own Bitcoin. And there is a narrative and a messaging around that, right? And it's not that different when we say, hey, why are you joining Instagram? You're joining Instagram because there's a network you want to partake in. The difference, though, is that the network of Instagram you don't own. You can't partake in its growth. But the network of Bitcoin or any other token ecosystem, you can partake in its growth because you own a stake of that, and then you have a vested interest in its success because you have ownership of that. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't quite understand because they think of value in the classical sense, whereas I think we need to look at this asset based on the network effects. So what's the strength of the network effect is the value essentially of, I guess, that particular token ecosystem in the case of Bitcoin. And, brands are like this, right? If I have a brand or am a fan of a sports brand or a musician, you're not a fan purely because of the great music or because of his great artistry. You become a fan and its value comes from the fact that 100 other people agree, and then 1,000 other people agree, and then 1,000,000 other people agree. What just happened? A network effect, right? And the more people agree, the more value comes from that, right? That's basically sort of the network state. Okay, so that's a long-winded way to say that this is a kind of asset, and this is where we think the future will go, that everyone can have. So we believe that network states, or basically community-owned networks, are going to be bigger than any companies in the world. Bitcoin today is probably top 6, top 7 company in the world, if it was a company, and of course number 2, basically asset. And in time, we think that Bitcoin and other network states are going to be much bigger than corporations. Why? Because they're the only type of institutional, if you want to call it that can be owned by millions of people, right? So Facebook,
it's powerful.
Yeah,
it's powerful.
It's powerful, correct. I mean, and so ownership gives it that sort of strength. You don't have 100 million shareholders of Apple, but you can have 100 million people who own tokens or Bitcoin, right? And that to me is basically the effect of what we see in nation states, the same kind of nationalism, patriotism, all that type of stuff that comes into play is what we see today play out basically in token economies. And so when you think about games that are launching, that are bringing people into Web3, of course, they may be owning these assets, like one, for instance, with Beyond Life, with BeLife, that's a Bitcoin-based metaverse. People are basically playing games. They have a way of earning that token. They can then basically get back into Bitcoin. It's based on the Bitcoin ecosystem. That actually onboards people who are not yet in the space, and they can earn their way into the ecosystem by building their own networks. And that goes back to my first point, which is why I don't think third-party sort of ecosystems are sort of detracting. They're adding value, because how else do you make it inclusive? If you ask someone to just buy Bitcoin on day one, you're the poorest person in the room. Nobody wants to be the poorest person in the room, generally speaking, right? I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, and this is kind of the immigrant story, right? You go in as an immigrant, and you're literally the dregs of the society for the time being, and you want to work your way up. But you don't want that, right? You want to sort of emerge in the place where you have status, and that's kind of where these new communities come in. These new network communities create a new subculture in those environments, and to me, they're basically kind of like a sharded network before they go back into Bitcoin, where they find their ecosystems in their areas, they find their communities. We see this in society, whether they're ethnic societies, whether they're gaming societies, whether they're hobby societies. They all come together in these little groups and say, okay, we're part of this community, and really they've built a network. And then eventually, one of them might buy a house in Beverly Hills, right? And that to me is kind of the Bitcoin narrative. It's kind of the same way I think of it. No,
it's very interesting to think about some of these communities, these networks that are being built as ultimately sort of entry points into Bitcoin, right? It's a smaller group. There's a way to kind of be high status in that group. And then as you grow, you're eventually going to want to hold your wealth. You're going to want to store your wealth in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is money.
Correct. And I mean, despite everything, everyone was like, back in the day, was like saying, oh, Bitcoin will sort of, lose its dominance and everything. When has Bitcoin lost its dominance, right? In that stage, right? And, it goes up and down by a couple of percentage points and so this or take, right? But Bitcoin dominance has always been over 50%. And I think it will continue to do so precisely because of its status value and because, it's the reserve asset of Web3.
Absolutely. So, and you mentioned Bitcoin dominance too. The other thing I would say to that is really we're probably even measuring it wrong because the Bitcoin dominance is 100%. And it's just a matter of all the other assets in the space being denominated in Bitcoin terms and valued in Bitcoin. And so, it's like, what's dollar dominance compared to the stock market? It's 100%. All the stocks are based in dollars. All of the, new world of digital assets will be valued in Bitcoin.
I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because at the end of the day, if you had to make a choice for most of the community and you said, hey, if there's one asset, if you had to make that nuclear decision of choosing one asset or the other, I think most people will end up choosing Bitcoin for that reason, because of the fact that it has that sort of most powerful network effects within that. That said, though, I think the beauty of people being able to launch new projects is actually part of, I think, the ethos of, I would say, Bitcoin as well, which is the liberty and freedom to do essentially these new launches, to emerge from that. And I actually think it empowers Bitcoin. The more these projects happen, actually the more powerful Bitcoin becomes. Not just because they go back into it or want to get into it, but because of the fact that it is the one network that is the most decentralized, the most sort of owned, right? The whole ethos of sort of this liberty, freedom, capitalism embedded in Bitcoin is the most powerful of them all, right? It's the one you want to ultimately always immigrate to.
Absolutely. Well, so to kind of round out the conversation, obviously I'm from the U.S. Animoca, you guys are based in Hong Kong. We're sitting here in Abu Dhabi, right? How do you view sort of this dynamic global movement, and what sort of intricacies in terms of how they interact with culture, the differences in the cultures, how people are using Bitcoin around the world? What do you see, and how do you kind of take advantage of that as someone who's building a cultural engine within the Bitcoin space?
So the one thing that we generally think of Web3 and Bitcoin in particular is that it is basically digital capitalism, right? And to be clear, most of the way that we operate in Web3 today, in Web2, sorry, or in games, is not capitalist at all, right? You're basically more in a socialist, merit-based type of framework, right? You could have 1 million followers, you could have 10 million followers, you're still all the same, right, in a way, in terms of value. You have a different reputation, but you don't have more value because there's no way to do that. In Web3, that's completely the opposite, right? And in fact, interesting enough, the defense mechanism of Bitcoin and probably every other token framework is capitalist in nature, right? It's the money in the system that defends the network, that creates the incentives to do that. So that's the framework. And so one of the reasons why, especially in the last few years, Asia has really sort of taken off. I mean, you look at, for instance, trading volume on Bitcoin and tokens in Korea, through the roof, bigger than any other nation, sort of, many nations even put together. And it's not just because of the tax regime. It's because in Asia, capitalism is widely celebrated as a whole, which is kind of interesting, right? I sometimes say the American dream is more alive and well in Asia than it is in America. Because a lot of Americans, and we can see this from the whole sort of, we can see this from the political divide, that there's a large swath of Americans who don't believe in capitalism, right? And believe in a form of socialism, maybe if they don't fully understand it, doesn't matter, because they felt left out from that system. And to me, those are the same people who are against crypto, against Bitcoin, because it represents that. It's a knee-jerk reaction. Remember, when people talk negatively about Bitcoin, it's not based on a logical argument. It's a gut, anger, that type of thing.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, a lot of these people that are against it have built this schema that they are inherently isolated from the systems of wealth creation and of participation in society. And here we have this credibly neutral, provably neutral monetary system, new network that they can participate at a completely fair way, the same way that every other person participates, and they reject it. It's mind-boggling to think that they would.
Well, it's one, because I think people have very low financial literacy. And I think in the West even more so lately, because the education system doesn't actually focus on that. I say this, and I can probably say this living in Hong Kong as a Chinese person, so maybe it wouldn't sound too bad. But, there's an obsession that we have when you go to another country. We always look at real estate and say, well, what's that cost, right? Why is that, right? There's an obsession that we have in Hong Kong about real estate, and I would say most Chinese people. Sorry for those who don't agree. And why is that? Because we are brought up to measure things in terms of value somehow. And so we try to measure a society in terms of what is that worth as a way, right? And things like in Hong Kong, it's very common because of the jockey club that people basically, for fun, gamble. And, and then there's mahjong, which is basically a Chinese version of poker in very simple terms, right? And that's basically what you do in a pastime. So this idea of money and trading and playing with money, not in a super serious way necessarily, it's just part of that culture. And so it's not a surprise that that type of culture will then embrace capitalism and therefore Web3 and digital assets much more faster than a place. I grew up in Europe. And in Europe, I wasn't even allowed to talk about money, right? And if there was someone who had money, he had to hide it. And so someone could have a Mercedes-Benz, he would not drive to school, he would park the car somewhere else and walk so they wouldn't see the car, right? Because you didn't want to give people the impression that, he has money, whatever, right? And so there's a thing. And America, what attracted me to America when I first moved there a while ago, when I was younger, was it was that land of opportunity. And when you made wealth, it was celebrated because you could do it, right? You had a chance, right? It's still the only country in the world where immigrants run the two largest companies in the world, right? I mean, maybe not after NVIDIA, but the point is, right, Google and Microsoft are not run by Native Americans. So that's the powerful thing. And that's what America was celebrated for. And now, I think that kind of previous narrative was against that, to the point that's because people were against capitalism. And so I think that was a distinction. But I think that's all shifting around now, right? And so I think America, which is the heart of capitalism, is now, I think, embracing that fully, as we've seen from previous speakers and everything that's happening in space. And so I think that will be celebrated again, and I think that will be part of the impetus of that growth. And I think the most powerful thing is that people who have been excluded from that system, like what you see with Web3 gaming in Philippines or Indonesia, right? They ended up basically being able to play Web3 games, then making a little bit of value in money, but now they actually were financially included. They couldn't even have a bank account, but they can have a crypto wallet, for instance, right? So that actually will onboard the next billions of people. And to me, the really big unlock is going to be the kind of digital property rights, or property rights generally, that legal frameworks were not able to support, that essentially digital can do at less than $1. So for instance, I could own, like we have in some projects where teachers can create their intellectual property rights and protect them in the form of an NFT, that then is a way in which they can generate, essentially when they sell it, they can get 5 or 10 times forward value for it, kind of like real estate or any kind of asset out there. The reason why you can't do this for most assets is because you have to have a minimum amount of money that you can make, right? So like a house or music royalties that make at least hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Otherwise, it's not worth the legal framework to protect it. But again, with an NFT, you can do that for less than $1. So that means we see a proliferation of these type of digital and intellectual property rights in all areas, which to me is the way that just how physical property rights has given a huge wealth explosion to really our societies today over the last hundreds of years. We're going to see an even bigger wealth explosion driven by those places that never had property rights, now because of Bitcoin and because of blockchain can now have that.
Yes, well, so, we only have a couple of minutes left, and kind of in that spirit, I'm really curious. Let's take a 4-year lens, because Bitcoin likes to move in 4 years, and the market likes to move in 4 years. At the end of 4 years, this is, 2028, December? Where do you think sort of this digital ownership world, what are some of the frameworks that you think that we can build in the next 4 years and really start to activate, not just speculate on, but truly use in our day-to-day lives?
So, there's a lot of that already happening in the financial world, so I won't go into that, right? Obviously with DeFi and trading and assets and so on, right? But I see a number of big unlocks, right? One I already spoke about, which was essentially intellectual property rights in other areas that haven't been able to protect before. Like we have some quirky companies in our portfolio that are literally protecting their dance moves. That sounds funny, right? But actually the genesis of that story was that the dancer had his moves on TikTok. Epic, the company behind Fortnite, literally just took those dance moves and made it an emoji that was hugely popular. And the dancer was like, hey, that's my dance move. And Epic was like, prove it, right? I got it on TikTok. I don't know if you made it, right? Again, blockchain could have solved that. Anyway, those are some examples, right? But the other area that I think would be really massive, in which we're investing time in with things like with Mochaverse, is digital reputation. So we think, digital identity has been much spoken about, but we think reputation is perhaps the biggest value unlock over the next coming years in our space, because everything we do trades on reputation, right? In other words, unsecured credit markets, those open up because they're entirely based on reputation. But how do we create those reputation frameworks today? We can't. In Web3, everything is over-collateralized, right? I have $1 million in Bitcoin, I can borrow, $700,000. Great. But that's really difficult to bring in new people, right? The way that I think of the Web3 hiring process, if it was that way, it's like, I'll hire you, but you got to deposit $100,000 first before I can hire you, right? Those are the issues that we have in the market that has no direct trust because I don't know who you are. But with zero knowledge proof, with digital identity, we can now actually create frameworks where other people can attest your reputation to you. What did you do with your tokens? What did you do in the game? And I don't need to know who gave it to you, but I can prove on blockchain absolutely whether you have a good reputation or a bad reputation without revealing your name. We'll solve things like these sort of bots, the bot farming. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying that reputation must be human. I think an AI can have a good reputation too. And they can be autonomous and they can do stuff, because if you have a good reputation as an AI, I'll do business with you. I'll give you tokens, I'll work with you, right? And I think that will unlock the multi-trillion dollars of markets today that are things like credit cards, student loans, all these areas. That's the kind of money that we need to bring into the system, and I think that's going to be the big unlock. And it will come from more financial literacy and things like gaming and so forth.
That's a really great point, and we only have a few seconds, and so we'll have to continue this conversation. But bringing up things like AI agents that are starting to emerge and pulling reputations against them. Another trend that you made me think of was in the previous political election cycle, the release of video footage, the release of all of this media, and the other side claiming, oh well, that's a fake. This is a trend that is going to be continuing to rise.
But blockchain can solve that, right? Yes.
And these are all files that can be hashed and the hash can be checked. So yeah, there's so much to build, so little time. Our time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, Yat Siu from Animoca Brands. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is your company ready for the next evolution in financial strategy? Bitcoin for Corporations is your partner in securing the future of your business. With exclusive membership benefits, our comprehensive masterclass, and a network of trusted service providers, we provide the insights and resources to help you incorporate Bitcoin into your financial strategy, ensuring stability and long-term value. Strengthen your business. Innovate with confidence. Bitcoin for Corporations, protecting your treasury and positioning you for the future.